Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Sister Sue, or maybe your name's Sister Jackie. I don't know. But anyway, we're sisters. And if our audience is not aware of that, well, they can be. For this is our number 125 Fun Chat, 1950s Fun Chat that we've done. And why is it that we are so obsessed with the 1950s? Any idea? Sister?
Well, let's just get on with it.
Okay. Well,
we find it interesting, and we hope others do as well.
Yes,
because
we lived in that decade.
Modern history.
We lived in that decade, and it was very impactful in our life. So take it away, sister.
Okay. So first of all, we'll start by asking the viewers to look at the bottom. You'll see the purple banner. www.whilethe.windmill.watched.com is where you'll find all sorts of information about the book named While the Windmill Watched, A Slice of Rural America in the 1950s. Notice that little book in the upper right-hand corner. On this website, there'll be things about the author, where the authors are going to be speaking, or the events from which we will be partaking in, where you can buy the book, and the 1950s Fun Chat. As Janine mentioned, this is 125. So there are quite a few hours of viewing, should you care to be snowbound or something and want to watch those. So they are all very interesting, very educational, and everyone has a story. And we have tried to capture so many different stories from different stratas of life. Okay, up in the upper right-hand corner, I mentioned the book, and you'll see a little white symbol there. That represents the award that the book was given. The book was published in 2021. This came in 2022 as the Independent Press Award for the nonfiction regional category, and we were given the award of distinguished favorite
by the Independent Press.
By the Independent Press, yes. Yep. So on with the show. We have a lady here named Sharon Wasteney, who was born in 1947 in rural southwest Iowa in the town of Creston, the middle born of 3 children. The family farm was surrounded by those of her grandparents, aunts, and uncles, who all helped each other on their individual farms, especially during haying and corn harvest. Now, 4-H club activities and church youth group were very much a part of her family's activities. Her mother taught her to sew, and her paternal grandmother sparked her love of needlework. These influences led her to Iowa State University, where she graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in home economics education and a master's in family and consumer science education. She taught junior and senior high home economics, family consumer science for 16 years in the same school system from which she had graduated. Then she turned to Iowa State University Extension as the home economist, family development, and youth development educator. Now, Sharon and her husband, Craig, have a daughter who is a creative director in a design firm in Des Moines, Iowa. At times, she is Sharon's personal color advisor when choosing fabrics. Upon retirement, Sharon and Craig moved to Hannibal, Missouri, ready for a new adventure. With the encouragement of a quilt shop owner there, she went full steam ahead into quilting and designing, followed by publishing patterns and a book titled Hand Me Down Quilts. So Sharon, welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So how did the 1950s influence you becoming a fabric artist?
Well, I would have to say it came from my grandmother, because I think she kept trying to get me interested in needlework through starting with cross stitch. And, at that young age, I didn't have a lot of patience. I would get a little ways and then I was ready to move on to something else. The other thing I remember from from her was that she tried to teach me to crochet also, which I did learn how to do. But she said until I could do a mile a minute, she wasn't going to give me any projects to do. So, anyway, just having all those relatives close by at a time when women's work was in the home, and providing blankets, quilts, and needlework for setting a nice table, all of those types of things, as well as all the outdoor activities, gardening and chores with chickens and animals. All of that contributes, I think, to the value system that we have from that era.
I think you hit the nail on the head. The value system of the 1950s, so impactful in our lives then, and many people who lived in that era share that same thought.
Yeah.
And I want you are a quilter extraordinaire. So would you please tell me the term quilt? What is the meaning of that term quilt?
Well, actually, you might be surprised to know that some of the first quilts that we still have access to today were done in the 12th century. So quilting is simply a layering of fabrics, and usually with a batting or something in between, a front and a back and something in between, and then stitched together. And many cultures around the world have that type of needlework somewhere in their history.
Sharon, what did those early battings consist of? How were they? Straw? Were they fabric? What were they?
You know, I don't know. In more recent history here in America, they were cotton, and they came directly from the cotton mills, and they still had seeds in them. If you have access to any older quilts and you hold them up to the light, you will see little black dots in them, which are the seeds from the cotton bolls still in them. So that's what we know. Centuries ago, there was actually the quilted garments were actually armor for the soldiers, and so they had metal was what was a part of their quilted garment, but it was covered with cloth, so it wasn't batting in the sense that we know it today.
One of the earliest quilts that I recall our mom having had a wool batting in it. And
yes.
And how was a wool batting popular during a certain era?
I don't know about that, because we also had quilts that used feather ticking, and those quilts were tied. And so I think it's partly what we had access to. If you lived in an area where there were sheep, and they sheared the sheep and carded the wool into bats, then you used wool. If you were in an area where cotton was more prevalent, then you used cotton. And today, and I can't verify this, I guess I didn't look this up, but there are also silk battings. And so I don't know if those areas that had more access to silk, like the Asian countries, use those silk battings. I don't know for sure about that.
In the longevity of a quilt, how must it be cared for in order to still be useful or of display in today's world?
There's a lot of controversy, or I shouldn't say controversy. There's a lot of difference of opinion. Some people say you should never wash an old quilt. I have a quilt, actually, now it's over 100 years old, because it was made for my mother-in-law in 1921. And so we're in 2024. So it's over 100 years old, and it's not in real good condition. Some people would say you can soak them in water and lay them out on the lawn and let them dry, and that's fine. And other people will say, no, put some tulle over it and take a vacuum cleaner to it and just clean it that way. So there's a variety of opinions on that. If they were a quilt that was used a lot, they're going to be soiled. They're going to be stained. And there are things, there's a quilter in particular that I follow related to vintage quilts. And she uses a commercial product, soaks it in it, and things come out looking very clean. And, you don't throw them in the washing machine and you don't throw them in the dryer to do. You have to do a lot of handwork to do it, but you can preserve it. That 100-year-old quilt that I have, that literally the batting is coming out of it in places in some of the holes, I hung in my office at work for 20 years. And every time I got it from my mother-in-law. In fact, there's a story behind that. It was going to go to the burn barrel at her mother's sale, at my husband's grandmother's sale. It was sitting by the burn barrel. And I said, Clara, what are you doing with that? Oh, I'm just going to burn that. It's just trash. It's falling apart. And I said, can I have it? What would you want that for? I saved some good quilts for you. And I said, no, I'd like to have this one because it said down in the corner, made for Mary when she got married in 1921. And it's like, I think I want that. And every time she came into my office, she said, I just don't know why you have that hanging there. But to have it hanging, then that brings up another point that to hang that in my office, because it was so fragile, really, as old as it was, I put hanging sleeves on the back of all 4 of the edges so that I could rotate it. And it was a quilt that could be rotated so that it, you spread out the weight of the quilt over all of the sides, remembering to turn it a little bit. Same thing if they're folded up. You need to take them out at least once a year and refold them with different fold lines. So,
yeah. Wouldn't it be better to roll it anyway?
Yes, if you have the space to do something with rolling, a lot of people do that. They'll take tubes and cover them with fabric, carpet tubes, different textile tubes, cover that with fabric, and then roll them up. If you have a place where you can do that, yeah.
Sharon, so earlier you mentioned tool and then vacuum. What you mean, like tool, the fabric tool?
Yes, like the fabric tool. You would lay that over, like in.
And what's the purpose of that?
In textile museums, that's what they do. So you use a very fine tool. You don't use the wider, what's called net. You use tool that's very fine, and you lay that over the top of the quilt. That way, if there are holes in it, that type of thing, there's some protection against sucking all of that up. Right. So, yeah.
Many people might think, if they're unfamiliar with the term tool, maybe think of what a wedding veil would be made out of. That fine of fabric. Yes.
And the International Quilt Study Museum, excuse me, in Lincoln, Nebraska, really has some good information on how to preserve those quilts.
Okay. Sharon, you briefly touched on this quilt that you rescued and how it was signed. Was that customary for people? And I'm assuming most of these quilt makers were women. Was it customary to sign each quilt?
No, not a lot of them. They were made many times just for utilitarian purposes. And so it wasn't considered to be a work of art. It was simply to be used on the bed. And the reason this one was marked was because my husband's grandmother marked everything. I mean, everything. When we had her auction, everything had a piece of adhesive tape on the back, the bottom, the whatever, that had some kind of inscription on it. So she was really into that. My grandmothers didn't do any of that. So I think it was kind of a personal preference.
Sure, and a historian in her own right.
Yes, yeah. Sure.
As we meander through the years of quilting and the purposes of quilting, I'm thinking of maybe more in the 1940s, and as we meander into the 1950s, the use of feed sack fabrics. And were those used in quilts, or how were the fabrics acquired for quilting?
Well, I can remember because Saturday night was when you went into town with your can of cream and your eggs that we had as children. We washed a lot of those eggs. You took them into the creamery, and then we went in the back room, and my mother, I can still remember her going back and picking out the sacks of feed according to getting enough to make me a dress. And in fact, I can still picture my dress out of blue feed sacks that she embellished with some bias tape, embellishment sewn on it to make it look pretty, and made some little bows. And I had a dress that I really like, and obviously still remember to this day, and wish I had it.
I know Jackie and I experienced that same thing as far as going to the PV elevator and picking out the fabric, which from the chicken mash sacks that were at the elevator, what would be our next skirt or dress or fun. It was so fun.
And our mother made us each a quilt that has some of the squares are feed sack.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I don't have any, I don't know if, I assume maybe my grandmother that made a lot of quilts probably made some out of feed sacks, but I really don't recall seeing any of those quilts. What I do, the other quilt I have from my grandmother is one that she had made. My parents built a new house in 1957, 58, around in that time period. And so when we were moved into our new bedroom, she had made a quilt, and I still have that quilt. Again, it's quite raggedy also, but it was from a kit.
Oh.
And so I know, and I know my grandmother, that's how she accessed some of her fabric, was to order it through a kit. And in the 1930s, 1940s, there were a lot of those things available through women's magazines. In fact, I came across it, and I like to go to auctions and pick up quilts and quilt things. And one of the boxes I picked up one time was an incomplete quilt. It was an iris quilt, but it was done, the kit was had been designed and put together by a woman. I believe her name was Ann Orr. I know her last name was Orr. But with it was the printed material that said that you could make this quilt, but you probably should have it sent out to be quilted, because most homemakers did not have the skills to do the quilting justice that needed to be done on this quilt. And I just thought that was so amusing that they would put out that information. You wouldn't do that today in any kit that you sent out and said, now you really shouldn't quilt this because you're probably not skilled enough to do it.
Yeah.
Where did they expect a person to send this?
Well, there were mail order places, and living in the Midwest, most of what my grandmother got came out of Chicago. And so I assume that's probably where there were people that you could send it to, and they just sat there and hand quilted, by the way, those quilts, because that was the only way to quilt quilts. I still have acquaintances today that say it's not a quilt if it's not hand quilted. So.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and how do you feel about that?
Well, for a long time, I was probably with them, but my grandmother quilted on her treadle machine, utilitarian things. And what I have from that is a doll quilt. She made us, both my sister and I, doll quilts, and they were machine quilted, but they were then therefore of lesser quality, of lesser worth, that they were made of feed sacks. But machine quilting has come a long way since since those days when I first thought, I don't want my quilt machine quilted. I have to hand quilt this. So,
And more than likely it was with a treadle machine back then.
yes.
And didn't the feed dog, I mean, the presser foot would push the top layer, wouldn't it? How did they ever prevent it?
You know,
it was stifling.
I sewed on my grandmother's treadle machine, and it was fun. In fact, I have her treadle machine, but it's in a state of disrepair. But you know, when I think about those little doll quilts, which were obviously small pieces, there's not puckers, or it doesn't look like. So I don't know if the whole mechanism behind that, you know, if there wasn't as much tension between the feed dogs and the presser foot as we have now, you know, such a variety of ways to adjust that. So I don't know. I don't know.
Is that method called stippling or stippling?
Stippling.
Okay, so stippling, you do not put the presser foot down, and it's free hand. You just move it, move it.
Okay.
Yes, and actually, we had an exhibition at the Mark Twain Museum in Hannibal that I curated, and a lady brought in a quilt that had been quilted on a treadle machine, and she had described, the person that quilted it was from the late 1800s, early 1900s. She quilted it with a treadle machine, but the quilt was suspended in the air. She had a contraption that was, or a mechanism that held the quilt up away off of the machine. And and she quilted it that way. So, you know, women were very creative in their thinking about how they could handle those things. I think just as we are today, is they used what they had on hand, and we've relied a lot on mechanization and computerization, actually. But
were most quilts hand pieced as well as hand quilted back in the 1950s type era?
Yes. Now, my grandmother did do some machine piecing if they were straight pieces, but if there was any pattern that had a curve to it, like the quilt that I have is a grandmother's flower garden, it is all hand stitched. And in fact, the edge is even in the hexagon shape. There is no binding on it. She has simply turned under the backing and the front, folded them together, and she has done a very tiny buttonhole stitch all the way around this quilt, and it's a twin bed size. And so that's why it is literally in pieces, and I keep thinking, well, you know, maybe I should cut it up and give pieces to somebody, but I can't yet, because that nobody does that for binding nowadays. I mean, I don't know how many hours it must have taken her. And it was 1-inch hexagons. So they're small hexagons. And then to go around that edge she was a very fine needleworker. If she had entered quilts like we do today, I have no doubt that she would have been a prize winner. Her quilting was just exquisite. But
with your beautiful extreme creativity in quilt making and embellishing quilts of today, is that quilt and that type of binding something that you could use as an embellishment for a quilt today?
Sure. And some of those people that are really making quilts specifically to enter in international shows will take that kind of time. But it's a time consumer, obviously, to do that. But again, you know, we sit in the evenings and maybe watch TV, and that's what my grandmother did. I mean, her and my grandfather would sit in 2 rocking chairs, and I think the TV was in front of them. But, you know, back in the 50s and early 60s, there wasn't that much TV, and they would watch the news, and I'm not sure they even watched any other programs, but that's what she did at night. And then in the daytime, and we haven't talked about quilting bees or any of that kind of stuff that was very popular back then. She would go to, I don't know if it was once a week or every other week, they would have meetings and have a quilting bee. The neighborhood women all got together and quilted. And I'll share a story since this is kind of a chat. I have a great aunt. Actually, I have two great aunts that were quilters also, neither one of which were as good as my grandmother. And I can say that honestly, they would say that also. And I can tell their work. I have work from all of them, and I can pick out my grandmother's anytime because it's just impeccable. But I can remember I was helping my great aunt get ready to go to the quilting bee, and this is how they did it. She would take the quilting frames, those long boards that they put together with these clamps. Mm-hmm. And so she would take that all home at the end of the day to her house because she had a great big living room and area. And so she would set it up and then she would quilt there. But she said when I was helping her get ready to take it down from her place to go to the next lady's house, she said, "Now, Sharon, I can't tell anybody, but I had to rip out this one particular lady's stitches because they really weren't good. And so I had to do it all. So it doesn't look like I've done very much quilting. I have because I had to rip out this other lady's quilt stitches because they weren't good enough."
Yes, I've heard of that happening.
What is the oldest known quilt pattern in America?
Oh, when you asked that question, I thought, I guess I have to look that up. I don't know. The information I could find was actually what they cited was crazy quilts, which is not really a pattern, but because they were frugal and used things, even if you were in a wealthy household, you still used maybe the silks and satins from dresses and draperies and that type of thing to make a quilt. But crazy quilts was the only thing I could find that was definitive. Otherwise, when you start looking at patterns, like, everybody's familiar with a log cabin and that's been around for a long time. There's a lot of history about some of those types of things, but actually identifying what was the oldest pattern and actually the more wealthy tended to do more applique because they wanted to show off their fine needlework versus piecing was for the people that maybe needed to take advantage of the fabric that they had versus having something new. Broderie purse is a type of quilting that was available. I can remember visiting the International Quilt Study Museum in Lincoln when I think it was the oldest broderie purse quilt was on display there, and it was from the 1700s. So, and actually the oldest quilt that's still in existence is in two pieces. Part of it is in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and part of it is in a museum in Sicily. And it was made in the 1360. That's the date of it. So it's called the Tristan quilt. So that's actually still a quilt, even though it's in two pieces and in two different places. It's the earliest actual example that we still have of a quilt. But quilting goes back. I mean, quilting layers of fabric goes back. They can date it back as far as 3400 BC.
My goodness. When you talk about the wealthy having beautiful quilts, etc., who actually made those quilts for the family? Did the women of the home quilt, or did their maids make these quilts? How did that work?
Well, it's my understanding from what I read in history that it was the women of the household. That was their job. And little girls as young as 3 and 4 years old were taught to quilt and taught to do needlework in general, because there's a lot of those cross-stitched samplers and some of that type of thing. But you can find occasionally, I think it's getting rarer, little child's thimbles. They're teeny tiny little thimbles that little girls had when they learned to quilt.
I can remember seeing the early work of children when they would crewel or quilt or something, somehow do the ABCs and 1, 2, 3, the numbers.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. They would learn that way. And actually in some of our Amish communities, they're carrying on that tradition too. I know some women that have had Amish hand quilt some of their quilts, and they would be asked if it was okay if a child quilted on that quilt also, because they were teaching them how to quilt. And so they were asked, do you care if, how fine do you want this quilting to be, or is it okay if we are teaching a child to learn to quilt on it too?
I had always learned that quilting stitches are, if it's well done, should be 10 stitches to the inch. Is that true or not?
Yeah, that's kind of the rule of thumb. The Japanese quilters of today are well known for their tiny stitches, and I would say they might be more than 10 stitches. They might be 12 stitches per inch, and some even finer than that. But
and the fine needle that you have to have in order to make those stitches.
The needle tools are very important, and so to have there is a reason why they have quilting needles specifically for quilting, and people develop their likes and dislikes or their preferences for certain needles. I was taught when I first was getting into hand quilting that the shorter the needle, the tinier your stitches could be. And then we went through a period where a long, thin needle was very handy to be used to make small stitches. So again, I think it boils down to what have you learned to use and how you use it. And there's many ways to hand quilt. Do you do the stab? And that makes me think of another story. Do you want to hear this?
Yes. Let's hear it.
We're going back to the 50s now. When my grandmother, it was the South Valley Quilters. That was my first exposure to a group of women that quilted. They were called the South Valley Quilters. My mother could not participate. In fact, you couldn't participate in that group until you were married. And then my mother couldn't participate unless somebody wasn't going to be there. Now, that wasn't because she wasn't good or they didn't want her. It was because they only had so much space around the quilting frame. And so the older women had first choice of places, but they quilted in a church. And I can remember going with my mother and helping to push back the pews. And this was before I was 10 years old even. So this would have been the mid 50s. I was probably 7 or 8. And we would push back the pews. They weren't screwed in place or nailed in place or whatever. We moved them back. And then as a child, I think we were very good children. My sister and I would play underneath the quilt. And every once in a while, one of the ladies would be really nice and say, okay, Sharon or Kathy, I'm putting my needle through, you bring it back up through. And so they would put the needle down and we would look for it then and find it and go and push it back up.
How fine. There's a tradition, or not a tradition, but when you maybe your fingers pricked with blood, you leave that blood there. You don't take it away. It's bad luck.
Oh, I don't know that I've heard that. They always say spit on it. I can remember the ladies saying when they prick their fingers, spit on it. That'll take it out.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
But once you make a mistake, you don't remove it because that will be bad luck.
Yeah. Well, nobody told my aunt that.
Oh, okay. That when I took a quilting class, that was it. Yeah.
Let's talk about fabrics, how we obtain fabrics, how quilters obtain fabrics in the feed sack line. And then talking about the 50s, were there quilt shops then, or when were you first exposed to a quilt shop?
When was I first exposed to a quilt shop? Gosh, I don't know. What I remember is going into J.C. Penney's when they had those vacuum tubes and the cutters that rolled out the fabric, told you how measured out the fabric as you went through, and then cut it, and then they ripped it apart and tore it. And I mean, when we were coming out of the Depression and stuff, they used feed sacks, or they used what they had. They made do a lot, but and as I said, I can remember my grandmother ordering kits, and I know those were around in the 1930s. So I don't know that you could actually go and buy. I can remember my grandmother. There was a shop in Creston, and I can't remember what it was, the name of it, but it was what I would call a women's shop. They had corsets and girdles and hose and embroidery floss and all things that women would use, from needlework to undergarments. And so I can remember going there with her, and she would get her embroidery floss there or her thread there. I really don't remember. I don't remember the fabric.
Okay.
And I have to give a shout out to my favorite quilt owner in Hannibal, Missouri. She's been in business for almost 50 years, which is almost unheard of, because local quilt shops, people, especially with online, the industry, if you want to call it that, the hobby is changing, as life changes. So
tell us, Sharon, about, let's jump forward to where we are today. You are an internationally known quilter. You have the gift of artistry in designing your quilts. You make your own fabric. You create your own fabric. You write quilt books. Tell us a little more about your life today as a quilter.
Well, I guess I've always liked creating, and so when I discovered dyeing fabric, and actually I bought dyed fabric from other people, and decided, you know what, I think I want to know how to do this myself. So actually, again, I give credit to that quilt shop owner, Pat Welder in Hannibal, because she said, Sharon, you need to be sharing your designs. And it's like, oh, well, nobody wants, what I design, type of thing. And then, and it was just her encouragement, because I had been designing my own patterns for quite a while, but I never thought anybody else was interested in them to buy them. And plus, I thank you for your compliment, but I really like to be creative, and I like to encourage creativity. And so I say, don't make what I made. Here's the idea. Take it and run with it and do with what you want. But I really love dyeing fabric. I love it so much. And what comes out, I just pulled some things out last night and was pressing them, and it's like, okay, I'm going to have to try to sell these because I can't cut into them. I just love looking at them.
So what you have on now, is that hand dyed?
Yes, actually, this is a piece of linen that I dyed the linen, and then I made a blouse. Yeah. And I'm doing more of that kind of thing. I actually like to make, I'm getting back into making clothes. I mean, that's what I started out sewing clothes, and then got into the quilting actually in 1976 when the bicentennial came around. And actually that's when quilts started being recognized as more than just women's work, as more than blankets, although a lot of people still say, oh, it's a blanket. But so that's when I really got interested in quilts and quilting, and thinking about how can I use fabrics. And I really like to look at all fabrics. I'm not a fanatic about recycling or repurposing, but I have a rather large collection of damask tablecloths. In fact, one of the shirts that I have is actually made from a tablecloth that I dyed the tablecloth and then made it into a shirt. The tablecloth had lots of holes in it, and textiles, they say, are the #1 thing that's filling up our landfills. And so I'm trying to do my little teeny tiny part
Good for you.
to use them up. But this quilt behind me, I guess that's fabric, though. The one behind me, the orange is fabric that I dyed.
Gorgeous.
But I also like to take the damask napkins and rayon in particular. They're not all linen. I say linens in the broad sense, not linen as a fiber. A lot of them are rayon, and rayon takes the dye beautifully and brightly. And so I don't have any quilts here. I told Janine we're having a quilt show this Friday, and everything that I brought down with me is entered into the quilt show. But I take those linen napkins and dye them in lighter colors, more like my blouse, the lighter colors, and then I use those as background for applique with regular cotton fabrics, maybe commercial fabrics, maybe other fabric that I've dyed. Or I also tell people, because I teach classes in dyeing, bring in 1 yard of your ugliest fabric, and we're going to over dye it and make it into something beautiful. And so, so I'm looking even at my own fabric stash and saying, okay, let's use this fabric. What color might I try to dye this so that it doesn't look quite so ugly?
Yeah. Which
I don't buy ugly fabric. It was beautiful, I'm sure, when I bought it.
Yes. Sharon, we're at the end of our fun chat. Unfortunately, we could learn so much more from you. But I do want people to know that you have a website. It's www.something, all lowercase, somethingstitched, STITCHED.com. And what will they find when they go to your website?
Actually, I don't post there a lot, but I try to post inspirational things, and it may be inspiration in why didn't I think of that? It may be inspiration in here's how you might do this process. I don't do a lot of technique types of things. There's 11 people out there doing that type of thing. So it's more inspiration, and then I post also on Instagram and Facebook things that I'm at, the dyed fabrics or the completed projects or something like that.
And your Facebook page is Sharon Wasteney, or is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just Sharon Wasteney. My Instagram is Something Stitched.
Okay. Well,
and then I do have an Etsy shop, but I don't have it. I have a few patterns on there right now. I don't have any of my dyed fabric on there, but my Etsy shop is Posy Lane Linens, which is all one word.
Okay. Well, fabric enthusiasts, fabric artists, quilters, give that website and all these other little social media opportunities an opportunity to inspire you, because Sharon is an inspiration. I first learned of her by seeing her posts on Facebook, and I thought, this is amazing. And we're so grateful that you took the time to chat with us.
Thank you. And it's just starting to pour down rain again. So
and Sharon,
it didn't interfere with us.
Sharon is in South Texas now, but her home is Hannibal, Missouri. And so it's just been wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was fun.
Good.
Jackie, how can you close our program?
Yeah. So viewers, take a look at continue before you sign off. There's a red subscribe button. There's a blue thumbs up button. Please touch those. And then until next time, tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat. Until then, toodaloo.